Number 1. Robert Hansen, the Iowa farm boy who became Alaska's most prolific serial killer. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in Esterville, Iowa, a small town in the northern part of the state where his Danish immigrant parents ran a local bakery. Growing up in this quiet Midwestern community, Hansen endured a childhood marked by severe acne, a stutter that made him the target of relentless bullying, and a father who was both demanding and emotionally distant, expecting perfection from a son who struggled to fit in with his peers. The young Hansen found solace in hunting, spending countless hours in the Iowa wilderness developing the tracking and marksmanship skills that would later become horrifyingly relevant to his crimes, becoming an expert marksman who could hit targets with deadly precision. His high school years in Esterville were characterized by social rejection, particularly from girls who mocked his appearance and speech impediment, experiences that fostered a deep-seated rage against women that would fester for decades. In 1960, Hansen was arrested in Pocahontas County, Iowa, for burning down a school bus garage, a crime born from anger over his social ostracism, and he served 20 months in prison, his first taste of incarceration that did nothing to address the psychological darkness growing within him. After his release, Hansen married and moved to Alaska in 1967, seeking a fresh start in Anchorage where he opened a bakery and presented himself as a respectable businessman and family man, even winning several hunting trophies and appearing to be a pillar of the community. However, between 1971 and 1983, Hansen abducted at least 17 women, primarily sex workers and exotic dancers from Anchorage, driving them to his remote cabin in the Alaskan wilderness where he would rape them before releasing them into the woods and hunting them like wild game with his high-powered hunting rifle and bow and arrow, a twisted recreation of his Iowa hunting days turned into the ultimate expression of his hatred for women. The investigation finally broke open when Cindy Paulson escaped from Hansen in June 1983, providing detailed information about his airplane, his vehicle, and the remote locations where he took his victims, though initially police were skeptical that a respected businessman could be responsible for such heinous acts. Alaska state troopers, working with FBI profilers, eventually obtained a warrant to search Hansen's home, where they discovered an aviation map marked with symbols that corresponded exactly to the locations where bodies had been discovered, along with jewelry and identification belonging to his victims, providing irrefutable evidence of his crimes. Hansen confessed to killing 17 women, though investigators believe the actual number may be higher, and he led police to several previously undiscovered grave sites in the Alaskan wilderness, showing no remorse but rather a clinical detachment as he described each murder. In 1984, Hansen pleaded guilty to 4 of the murders plus several kidnapping and assault charges as part of a plea agreement that allowed him to avoid the death penalty, and he was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never walk free again. The case revealed how Hansen's childhood experiences in Iowa, particularly the bullying and rejection he endured in Esterville, had metastasized into a pathological need for power and control over women, demonstrating how early trauma and untreated psychological issues can evolve into the most extreme forms of violence. Hansen's story also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized women, particularly sex workers, whose disappearances were initially not taken seriously by law enforcement, a systemic failure that allowed Hansen to continue killing for over a decade. Robert Hansen died on August 21, 2014, at Alaska Regional Hospital at the age of 75, having spent 30 years in prison, and his case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how a quiet Iowa farm boy transformed into one of America's most sadistic serial killers, his crimes forever linking the peaceful farmlands of Esterville to the frozen killing fields of Alaska. Number 2. John Wayne Gacy, the Waterloo native who became the killer clown. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, but his father, John Stanley Gacy, was a Danish-American whose family had deep roots in Iowa, and young John spent significant portions of his childhood visiting relatives in Waterloo, Iowa, where he would later return as an adult and commit crimes that foreshadowed his eventual descent into becoming one of America's most notorious serial killers. Gacy's childhood was marked by physical and psychological abuse from his alcoholic father, who would beat him with a razor strap and constantly berate him as stupid and worthless, creating deep psychological scars that Gacy struggled with throughout his life. While his mother tried to protect him, creating a dynamic that left Gacy confused about his identity and desperate for his father's approval. In 1964, Gacy moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where he managed 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by his father-in-law, quickly becoming involved in community organizations including the JCs, where he threw himself into civic activities and was named Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo JCs chapter, presenting a public image of a successful, community-minded businessman. However, in 1968, Gacy was arrested in Black Hawk County, Iowa, for sexually assaulting a teenage boy, Mark Miller, who was the son of a fellow JC member, a crime that shattered his carefully constructed respectable image and revealed the dark predatory nature that he had been hiding beneath his community involvement. During the investigation, it emerged that Gacy had sexually assaulted multiple teenage boys in Waterloo, using his position of authority and trust to lure young men to his home with promises of employment or alcohol, then coercing them into sexual acts through a combination of manipulation, intimidation, and physical force. Gacy was convicted of sodomy in December 1968 and sentenced to 10 years in the Anamosa State Penitentiary in eastern Iowa, where he served 18 months before being paroled in June 1970, a shockingly short sentence that would have deadly consequences when he relocated to Illinois. While Gacy was incarcerated at Anamosa, his wife divorced him and he lost contact with his 2 children, but rather than taking responsibility for his actions, Gacy blamed the victims and society, developing elaborate justifications for his behavior that would enable his later crimes. The Iowa Board of Parole's decision to release Gacy after less than 2 years, despite the serious nature of his crimes and psychological evaluations that suggested he was a danger to society, represents a catastrophic failure of the criminal justice system that directly enabled his subsequent murder spree. After his release, Gacy moved to Cook County, Illinois, where between 1972 and 1978 he murdered at least 33 young men and boys, burying most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, while maintaining his public persona as Pogo the Clown, entertaining children at hospitals and community events. The investigation that finally brought Gacy to justice began when 15-year-old Robert Pius disappeared after telling his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a summer job, and that contractor was John Wayne Gacy, leading police to obtain a search warrant for his home where they discovered the horrifying burial site beneath his house. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, and eventually confessed to killing 33 young men, providing details about each murder with chilling matter-of-factness, explaining how he would lure victims to his home, overpower them, torture them with a makeshift garrote device, and then dispose of their bodies. The trial, which began in 1980, featured extensive testimony about Gacy's psychological state, with his defense team arguing that he was insane and suffering from multiple personality disorder, while the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation and calculation that demonstrated Gacy knew exactly what he was doing and understood it was wrong. On March 13, 1980, the jury found Gacy guilty of 33 murders, and he was sentenced to death, spending 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois before being executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. The Gacy case forced Iowa to confront how its criminal justice system had failed so spectacularly in Waterloo, releasing a convicted child sex offender after minimal incarceration without adequate monitoring or treatment, a failure that haunts the state to this day and led to significant reforms in how sex offenders are supervised after release. Families of Gacy's victims have consistently pointed to his Iowa conviction and early release as a critical missed opportunity to prevent dozens of murders, arguing that if he had served his full sentence or received proper psychiatric treatment, their loved ones would still be alive. The case also revealed the vulnerability of young men and boys to predators who use positions of authority and trust to gain access to victims, and how society's reluctance to acknowledge male victims of sexual violence allowed Gacy to operate for years without serious scrutiny. Today, the Waterloo community rarely speaks publicly about John Wayne Gacy's connection to their city, but the case remains a dark chapter in Iowa history, a reminder that evil can hide behind a friendly smile and community involvement, and that failures in the criminal justice system can have devastating, far-reaching consequences. Number 3. Stephen Sueppel, the Iowa City Family Annihilator. Stephen Sueppel appeared to have everything that defined success in Iowa City. He was a respected vice president and controller at Hills Bank and Trust Company, lived in a beautiful home in an affluent neighborhood, was married to his college sweetheart Cheryl, and was raising 4 young children who were thriving in school and activities. However, On the morning of March 23, 2008, Iowa City Police discovered one of the most horrific crime scenes in the city's history when they found the bodies of Cheryl Sueppel, age 42, and the couple's 4 children, Ethan, 10, Seth, 8, Mira, 5, and Marshall, 3, all brutally murdered in their home on Barrington Road, beaten to death with what investigators believe was a baseball bat while they slept in their beds. Just hours after the bodies were discovered, Stephen Sueppel, age 42, drove his van at high speed into a concrete pillar on Interstate 80 near North Liberty, killing himself in what was clearly a deliberate act of suicide following the murder of his entire family. The investigation revealed that Sueppel had been living a double life, maintaining the appearance of a successful banking executive and devoted family man while secretly embezzling money from Hills Bank, stealing approximately $560,000 over several years to support a lifestyle that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Bank officials had discovered the embezzlement on March 19, 2008, just 4 days before the murders, and Sueppel had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, knowing that criminal charges were imminent and that everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his standing in the community was about to collapse. Rather than face the consequences of his actions and allow his family to move forward without him, Sueppel made the catastrophic decision to annihilate his entire family, a horrifyingly selfish act that demonstrated his view of his wife and children not as independent human beings but as extensions of himself that could not be allowed to exist in a world where he was disgraced. Evidence recovered from the scene indicated that Sueppel had written notes explaining his actions, though the specific content of those notes has never been fully released to the public, with investigators suggesting they contained justifications for the murders that revealed a deeply narcissistic and controlling personality. The murders shocked Iowa City, a university town that prided itself on its safety and community values, forcing residents to confront how someone could commit such unspeakable violence against his own children, innocent victims who trusted their father completely and had no awareness of the financial crimes he had committed. The case sparked intense discussion about family annihilators, a specific type of mass murderer, typically male family breadwinners, who kill their entire family and often themselves when facing financial ruin, legal troubles, or other threats to their status and identity, viewing their family's death as preferable to the shame of their failures being publicly revealed. Psychologists who studied the case noted that Sueppel exhibited classic traits of this type of killer: extreme narcissism, an inability to separate his identity from his role as provider and respected community member, and a fundamental lack of empathy that allowed him to view his family's murder as a rational solution to his problems rather than the ultimate act of selfishness and evil. Hills Bank and Trust Company cooperated fully with the investigation, implementing new financial controls and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar embezzlement schemes, though the monetary losses paled in comparison to the human tragedy that Sueppel's crimes produced. The Iowa City School District, where the Sueppel children attended school, provided counseling services for students and staff traumatized by the murders, with many children losing classmates and friends in a tragedy that was difficult for young minds to comprehend. A memorial service held for Cheryl Sueppel and her 4 children drew hundreds of mourners who remembered a loving mother and 4 bright, promising children whose lives were stolen by the very person who should have protected them above all else, with speakers emphasizing that the victims should be remembered not for how they died but for how they lived. The criminal investigation concluded without charges being filed since the perpetrator was dead, but civil litigation followed as the bank sought to recover the embezzled funds from Sueppel's estate, though no amount of money could compensate for the 5 lives destroyed by his actions. The case forced Iowa to examine how financial pressure and threats to masculine identity can trigger extreme violence, particularly in men who derive their entire sense of self-worth from their professional success and community standing, revealing a toxic psychology that values reputation over human life. Today, the house on Barrington Road where the murders occurred has new owners and the physical scars of that terrible night have been erased. But the psychological scars remain for a community that lost 5 of its members to an act of violence so incomprehensible that it still defies rational explanation. The Sueppel case stands as one of the most disturbing crimes in Iowa history not because of the method or the gore, but because it represents the ultimate betrayal of trust, a father's decision to murder his own children rather than face the consequences of his own criminal behavior, a reminder that the greatest danger sometimes comes from within the home, from those we trust most completely. Number 4. Michelle Kehoe, the Tiffin mother who attempted double filicide. On October 26, 2008, emergency dispatchers in Johnson County, Iowa, received a frantic call about a woman found on a rural road near Tiffin, bleeding from her neck and claiming that she and her 2 young sons had been attacked by an unknown assailant, setting in motion an investigation that would reveal one of the most disturbing cases of attempted filicide in Iowa history. Michelle Kehoe, age 35, told investigators that a man had carjacked her van while she and her sons, 7-year-old Seth and 2-year-old Sean, were inside, then drove them to a remote location where he attacked all 3 of them before fleeing, leaving her for dead alongside her children. Law enforcement immediately launched a massive search for the alleged attacker, mobilizing deputies from multiple counties and initiating an intensive investigation. But almost immediately, inconsistencies in Kehoe's story began to emerge that caused investigators to question whether her account was truthful. Emergency responders found 2-year-old Sean Kehoe dead at the scene from deep cuts to his throat, while 7-year-old Seth Kehoe was critically injured with severe lacerations to his neck but miraculously still alive, clinging to life despite wounds that would have killed most people, demonstrating extraordinary resilience that would ultimately help bring his mother to justice. As investigators processed the crime scene and interviewed Michelle Kehoe at the hospital where she was being treated for her own neck wounds, which were notably superficial compared to those inflicted on her children, they discovered evidence that contradicted her carjacking story. There were no signs of a struggle consistent with an abduction, no unknown fingerprints or DNA, and the pattern of injuries did not match her description of the attack. Within hours, Seth Kehoe regained consciousness at the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics, and despite his severe injuries and trauma, he was able to provide information to investigators that shattered his mother's fabricated story, telling them that his mother, not a stranger, had attacked him and his little brother. The investigation revealed that Michelle Kehoe had been experiencing severe financial stress, marital problems with her husband Eugene, and had been researching life insurance policies and methods of suicide in the days and weeks before the attack, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Kehoe had withdrawn money from the family's bank account, written notes to family members, and made other preparations that indicated she had planned to kill her children and herself, viewing their deaths as a solution to her problems, though like many attempted filicide suicides, she ultimately could not follow through with taking her own life after murdering her children. Eugene Kehoe, the children's father, was at work at the time of the attack and was completely unaware of his wife's plans, returning home to discover that his youngest son was dead and his oldest son was fighting for his life, all at the hands of the woman he had married and trusted to care for their children. Investigators theorized that Michelle Kehoe's motive was a combination of severe depression, financial stress, and a distorted belief that death would be preferable for her children than living through whatever hardships she imagined they would face, a tragically common rationalization among parents who kill their children. Michelle Kehoe was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Sean Kehoe and attempted murder in the attack on Seth Kehoe, facing potential life imprisonment without parole if convicted, and she pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, setting up a legal battle over her mental state at the time of the attacks. The trial, which took place in 2010, featured extensive testimony from mental health experts, with the defense arguing that Kehoe was suffering from severe mental illness including depression and psychosis that prevented her from understanding the wrongfulness of her actions, while the prosecution presented evidence of planning and deliberation that demonstrated she knew exactly what she was doing. Seth Kehoe, who was 9 years old by the time of the trial, did not testify in person, but his statements to investigators were presented to the jury, providing the most damning evidence against his mother as he described how she had attacked him and his brother in the van, using a knife to cut their throats while they were strapped into their car seats, unable to escape or defend themselves. The jury deliberated for approximately 8 hours before finding Michelle Kehoe guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder, rejecting her insanity defense and concluding that while she may have been depressed and struggling with mental health issues, she understood the nature of her actions and knew they were wrong. On November 19, 2010, Judge Lars Anderson sentenced Kehoe to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Sean Kehoe, plus 50 years for the attempted murder of Seth Kehoe, ensuring she would never be released and could never harm her surviving son again. Seth Kehoe survived his injuries but carries both physical and psychological scars from the attack, living with his father and extended family members who have worked to provide him with as normal a life as possible despite the unimaginable trauma he endured at his mother's hands. The case highlighted the critical issue of maternal filicide, which, while statistically less common than other forms of homicide, represents a particularly devastating crime that challenges societal assumptions about maternal instinct and the protective nature of motherhood, forcing recognition that severe mental illness, stress, and distorted thinking can override even the most fundamental biological drives. Mental health advocates used the Kehoe case to argue for better screening and treatment for postpartum depression and other maternal mental health issues, suggesting that earlier intervention might have prevented the tragedy, though this argument remains controversial given the evidence of planning and deliberation in Kehoe's actions. The community of Tiffin and the broader Iowa City area struggle to comprehend how a mother could commit such violence against her own children, with the case receiving extensive media coverage that often focused on the question of how such a thing could happen, seeking explanations that might make sense of an act that fundamentally defies rational understanding. Today, Michelle Kehoe remains incarcerated at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville, where she will spend the rest of her life, while Seth Kehoe continues to grow and heal, demonstrating resilience and strength that offers hope even in the aftermath of unthinkable tragedy. The Kehoe case stands as one of the most disturbing crimes in Iowa history because it involves the most vulnerable victims, children attacked by the person who should have loved and protected them most, and because it forces confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the greatest danger to children comes not from strangers but from their own parents, and that mental illness and crisis can transform love into violence in ways that shatter families and communities. Number 5. Ledell Lee and the 1993 murders in Jacksonville. In the early morning hours of February 9, 1993, the small eastern Iowa community of Jacksonville, located in rural Davis County, was forever changed when Deborah Reese, age 26, was murdered in her home in a crime that demonstrated extreme brutality and callousness, shocking a tight-knit farming community where violent crime was virtually unknown. Deborah Reese was strangled to death in her home while her young daughter slept in another room, a murder that appeared to be committed during a burglary as items were stolen from the residence, though the level of violence used against Reese suggested that robbery was not the only motive. Ledell Lee, a 22-year-old African-American man from Arkansas who had been visiting relatives in the area, became the primary suspect in the murder after investigators discovered evidence linking him to the crime scene, including his fingerprints found in Reese's home and testimony from witnesses who placed him in the vicinity around the time of the murder. The investigation revealed that Lee had a criminal history including previous arrests for assault and theft, and that he had been in Iowa for only a short time before Reese's murder, staying with family members in the Jacksonville area while allegedly seeking employment. Law enforcement from the Davis County Sheriff's Office worked with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation to build a case against Lee, collecting physical evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the timeline of events on the night of the murder, eventually gathering enough evidence to charge Lee with first-degree murder. Lee was arrested in Arkansas after fleeing Iowa following the murder, and he fought extradition, claiming that he was innocent and that the evidence against him was fabricated or misinterpreted, but Iowa authorities successfully secured his return to face trial in Davis County. The trial, held in 1994, featured testimony from forensic experts about the physical evidence found at the scene, including fingerprints, DNA evidence, which was still relatively new technology at the time, and other trace evidence that connected Lee to the crime, while the prosecution also presented witnesses who testified about Lee's movements and behavior around the time of the murder. Lee's defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there were problems with the chain of custody and forensic analysis, suggesting that Lee was being wrongly accused, but the jury found the prosecution's case compelling and credible. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts, finding that Lee had broken into Deborah Reese's home with the intent to commit burglary, and when she discovered him, he murdered her to eliminate a witness, demonstrating a depraved indifference to human life. Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Deborah Reese, ensuring that he would never walk free again, and he was transferred to the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison to begin serving his sentence. However, the story did not end with Lee's conviction in Iowa, because in 1995, shortly after arriving in Iowa's prison system, Lee was also charged with the 1993 murder of Deborah Reese in Jacksonville, Iowa. Prosecutors in Arkansas charged Lee with capital murder in the 1993 death of Deborah Reese in Little Rock, creating a confusing situation where two different women with the same name were murdered within months of each other in different states, and Lee was charged with both crimes. The Arkansas case involved the murder of Deborah Reese, a 26-year-old woman who was beaten to death with a tire thumper in her Little Rock home in February 1993, in a crime that bore striking similarities to the Iowa murder, suggesting a pattern of violent behavior by Lee. Lee was convicted in Arkansas and sentenced to death, spending more than 2 decades on death row while his attorneys filed numerous appeals challenging his conviction based on claims of ineffective counsel, racial bias in jury selection, and the quality of forensic evidence used against him. The case attracted national attention in 2017 when Arkansas scheduled Lee's execution as part of a plan to execute 8 inmates before the state's supply of lethal injection drugs expired, leading to intense legal battles and public debate about the death penalty, the quality of Lee's legal representation, and whether there were legitimate doubts about his guilt. Despite last-minute appeals and requests for DNA testing that Lee's attorneys argued could prove his innocence, the United States Supreme Court declined to intervene, and Ledell Lee was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins Unit in Grady, Arkansas, on April 20, 2017, maintaining his innocence until the end. After Lee's execution, the Innocence Project and the American Civil Liberties Union conducted DNA testing on evidence from the Arkansas crime scene, and in 2022, they announced that DNA found on the murder weapon did not match Lee, raising serious questions about whether Arkansas had executed an innocent man, though this testing did not address the Iowa conviction, which was based on different evidence. The Iowa conviction remains in place, and there has been no successful challenge to the evidence presented in the Jacksonville murder case. Though Lee's death in Arkansas means he will never serve the Iowa sentence or have the opportunity to appeal that conviction further, the Reese family in Iowa, who lost their daughter, sister, and mother in the 1993 murder, have maintained that justice was served with Lee's conviction, though the controversy surrounding the Arkansas case and the subsequent DNA evidence has complicated the narrative of closure. The case highlights the complexities of criminal justice when a defendant is charged with multiple crimes in different jurisdictions, raising questions about which jurisdiction should have priority, how evidence should be shared, and what happens when different standards of proof or different qualities of investigation exist in different cases. For the Jacksonville community, the Deborah Reese murder remains a traumatic event that shattered the sense of safety in a small town, demonstrating that violent crime can reach even the most remote and peaceful places, bringing tragedy and loss that echoes through generations. The case also raises ongoing questions about the death penalty, wrongful convictions, and the reliability of forensic evidence, particularly in cases from the early 1990s when DNA technology was in its infancy and forensic standards were not as rigorous as they are today. Ledell Lee's name remains associated with one of Iowa's most disturbing crimes, a brutal murder in a small community that destroyed a family and challenged assumptions about safety and justice in rural America, while also becoming part of a larger national conversation about capital punishment and the possibility of executing innocent people. Number 6. Dustin Honken, the drug dealer who became a mass murderer. Dustin Honken grew up in Britt, Iowa, a small town in Hancock County with a population of barely 2,000 people, where he was known as a brilliant student with an exceptional aptitude for chemistry, graduating as valedictorian of his high school class and earning scholarships to attend college. But instead of pursuing a legitimate career in science, Honken used his knowledge to become one of the most prolific methamphetamine manufacturers in the Midwest. By the early 1990s, Honken was operating a massive meth production operation in northern Iowa, generating millions of dollars in revenue and supplying dealers across multiple states, using his chemistry expertise to produce exceptionally pure methamphetamine that commanded premium prices and made him wealthy beyond the dreams of most people in rural Iowa. In 1993, Honken's operation began to unravel when one of his associates, Greg Nicholson, was arrested by federal authorities and agreed to cooperate with investigators, providing detailed information about Honken's drug manufacturing operation in exchange for a reduced sentence, becoming a confidential informant whose testimony was expected to send Honken to federal prison for decades. On July 25, 1993, Greg Nicholson, his girlfriend Terry DeGius, and DeGius's 2 young daughters, 10-year-old Candy and 6-year-old Amber, disappeared from their home in Mason City, Iowa, vanishing without a trace in what initially appeared to be a voluntary flight to avoid Nicholson's upcoming testimony against Honken. However, investigators quickly suspected that Honken was responsible for the disappearances, believing he had murdered Nicholson and DeGius to prevent them from testifying, and had killed the 2 children simply because they were witnesses, eliminating an entire family to protect his drug empire. Despite intensive investigation, authorities could not locate the bodies or develop sufficient evidence to charge Honken with the murders, and he was instead convicted on federal drug charges and sentenced to prison, seemingly having gotten away with mass murder. The case remained unsolved for 7 years until Angela Johnson, Honken's former girlfriend who had helped him evade capture, was arrested on unrelated charges and eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators, providing the breakthrough that authorities needed to finally bring Honken to justice for the murders. Johnson told investigators that she had been present when Honken murdered Nicholson, shooting him in the head and dumping his body in a field, and that she had helped Honken murder Terry DeGius and her 2 daughters, luring them to a remote location where Honken shot all 3 of them, including the 2 young girls who begged for their lives before being executed. Johnson led investigators to a field near Mason City where she said the bodies were buried, and in November 2000, authorities excavated the site and discovered the remains of all 4 victims, their skulls showing the devastating effects of close-range gunshot wounds, confirming Johnson's account and providing the physical evidence needed to charge Honken with 4 counts of murder. The discovery of the bodies, particularly those of 10-year-old Candy and 6-year-old Amber DeGius, shocked even seasoned investigators who were hardened by years of working violent crimes, because the methodical execution of 2 young children represented a level of callousness and evil that was difficult to comprehend. Honken was charged with federal murder charges in addition to his existing drug convictions, facing the death penalty for killing witnesses in a federal investigation, and his trial in 2004 provided a detailed look at the scope of his crimes and the ruthless calculation with which he had eliminated anyone who threatened his criminal enterprise. Angela Johnson testified against Honken, providing graphic details about the murders and her own participation, though she claimed Honken had coerced her involvement and that she lived in fear of him, while the prosecution presented her as a willing participant who deserved her own severe punishment. The trial also revealed that Honken had murdered a 5th victim, Lori Duncan, a former girlfriend who had become a potential witness against him, shooting her in the head and burying her body in the same field as the other victims, making him responsible for at least 5 murders committed to protect his methamphetamine operation. On October 27, 2004, a federal jury found Dustin Honken guilty on all counts, including 4 counts of murder in furtherance of a continuing criminal enterprise, and recommended the death penalty, which the judge imposed, sending Honken to death row at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Angela Johnson was also convicted of her role in the murders and sentenced to death, becoming one of only a handful of women on federal death row, though her attorneys continued to argue that she was a victim of Honken's manipulation and abuse rather than an equal participant in the crimes. Honken spent 16 years on death row filing appeals and challenging his conviction, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel and claiming that his rights had been violated during the investigation and trial, but federal courts consistently rejected his arguments, finding that the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming and that he had received a fair trial. In July 2020, the federal government, which had resumed federal executions after a 17-year hiatus, scheduled Honken's execution, and despite last-minute appeals and requests for clemency, Dustin Honken was executed by lethal injection on July 17, 2020, at the age of 52, becoming the 4th federal prisoner executed that year. The families of Honken's victims, who had waited nearly 3 decades for justice, expressed mixed feelings about his execution, with some finding closure in his death while others said that no punishment could truly balance the loss of their loved ones, particularly the 2 young girls who were murdered simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Honken case exposed the dark underbelly of rural Iowa's methamphetamine epidemic, showing how the drug trade could breed extreme violence even in small communities traditionally characterized by low crime rates, and how the enormous profits from meth manufacturing could corrupt individuals and lead to unspeakable acts. The case also demonstrated the vulnerability of witnesses in criminal cases, particularly in drug prosecutions where cooperating defendants face very real threats of retaliation, raising questions about how law enforcement can better protect those who come forward to testify against dangerous criminals. For northern Iowa, particularly the communities of Britt and Mason City, the Honken case remains a source of shame and trauma, a reminder that exceptional intelligence and opportunity are not guarantees of moral behavior, and that small towns are not immune to the most serious violent crimes. The methodical execution of Candy and Amber DeGius, 2 innocent children who had no involvement in the drug trade and posed no real threat to Honken beyond their potential to testify about what they had seen, represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. demonstrating a capacity for evil that shook the conscience of Iowa and the nation. Today, Dustin Honken's name is synonymous with the worst of Iowa's criminal history, a brilliant mind turned to evil purposes, a mass murderer who killed without remorse to protect his criminal empire, and a symbol of how the methamphetamine epidemic could destroy not just individual lives but entire families and communities. Number 7. Jerry Marks, the Sioux City serial rapist and killer. Throughout the 1980s, women in Sioux City, Iowa, lived in fear of a serial rapist who was attacking women in their homes, breaking in during the night and assaulting them at knife point, leaving behind a trail of trauma but few clues about his identity, evading capture despite intensive investigation by the Sioux City Police Department and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. The attacks followed a consistent pattern. The perpetrator would break into homes where women lived alone or were alone at the time, wearing a mask or disguise, armed with a knife, and using overwhelming force and threats to terrorize his victims into compliance, demonstrating escalating violence and confidence with each attack. Between 1983 and 1991, investigators believed the same perpetrator was responsible for at least 15 sexual assaults in the Sioux City area, though the actual number may have been higher as some victims may not have reported the attacks due to shame, fear, or distrust of the criminal justice system's ability to catch their attacker. The case took a deadly turn on December 9, 1991, when Donna Witt, a 29-year-old Sioux City woman, was found murdered in her home, sexually assaulted and stabbed to death in an attack that bore the hallmarks of the serial rapist who had been terrorizing the city for years, but with a chilling escalation from sexual assault to murder. The investigation into Witt's murder became the top priority for law enforcement, who recognized that the perpetrator had crossed a line from sexual assault to homicide and was likely to kill again if not apprehended, mobilizing every available resource to identify and capture the killer. Jerry Marks, a 38-year-old Sioux City resident with a criminal history including burglary and assault, emerged as a suspect in the attacks, but investigators struggled to develop sufficient evidence to charge him, as DNA technology was still limited in the early 1990s and many of the rape kits from earlier attacks had been improperly stored or were degraded. The breakthrough came when advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to retest evidence from the Donna Witt murder scene and several of the earlier sexual assaults, developing a DNA profile of the perpetrator that could be compared to potential suspects. In 1997, Jerry Marks was arrested and charged with the murder of Donna Witt and multiple counts of sexual assault, with DNA evidence providing the scientific proof that connected him to the crimes, finally giving victims and the community the answers they had sought for more than a decade. The trial revealed the extent of Marks' predatory behavior, with multiple victims testifying about the terror he inflicted, describing how he had stalked them, studied their routines, and chosen times when they were most vulnerable to attack, demonstrating a calculated and methodical approach to his crimes. Marks showed no remorse during the trial, remaining cold and detached as victims described the lasting psychological damage he had caused, the fear that still gripped them years after the attacks, and the ways their lives had been fundamentally altered by his violence. The prosecution presented overwhelming DNA evidence linking Marks to the Witt murder and multiple sexual assaults, evidence that his defense attorneys could not effectively challenge, as the science was clear and irrefutable, placing Marks at the scene of multiple crimes. The jury found Jerry Marks guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Donna Witt and guilty on multiple counts of sexual assault, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus consecutive sentences for the sexual assault convictions, ensuring he would never be released. The conviction brought some measure of closure to Marks' victims, though many testified that they continued to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and other psychological effects of the attacks, and that no prison sentence could truly restore what Marks had taken from them. The case highlighted the devastating impact of serial sexual assault on communities, creating an atmosphere of fear that affects not just the direct victims, but all women who share characteristics with the victims or live in areas where attacks have occurred, fundamentally changing behavior and eroding the sense of safety. Law enforcement officials noted that the Marks case demonstrated the critical importance of properly preserving evidence from sexual assault cases, as the DNA evidence that ultimately convicted him might not have been available if rape kits and other evidence had not been carefully maintained despite the passage of time. The case also revealed gaps in the criminal justice system's response to serial sexual assault, as Marks had been able to continue attacking women for years despite being known to law enforcement, raising questions about whether earlier intervention might have prevented some attacks and Donna Witt's murder. Advocates for sexual assault victims used the Marks case to push for better resources for rape kit testing, improved victim support services, and stronger laws regarding sexual assault, arguing that society needed to take these crimes more seriously and devote more resources to prevention and prosecution. For Sioux City, the revelation that a serial rapist and killer had been operating in their community for nearly a decade was deeply traumatic, forcing residents to confront how vulnerable they had been and how close evil had been to their everyday lives. The families of Jerry Marks struggled with the revelation that their relative was responsible for such heinous crimes, with some expressing shock and disbelief while others acknowledged that they had always known something was wrong with him but had never imagined the extent of his violence. Donna Witt's family fought to keep her memory alive as more than just a murder victim, establishing a scholarship in her name and working to support other families affected by violent crime, transforming their grief into action that might help prevent future tragedies. Jerry Marks remains incarcerated in the Iowa prison system, where he will spend the rest of his life, a predator finally caged after years of terrorizing women and destroying lives. His capture made possible by advances in forensic science that gave voice to evidence that had been waiting silently for justice. The Marks case stands as one of Iowa's most disturbing crimes not because of a single act of violence but because of the sustained campaign of terror he waged against women over nearly a decade, demonstrating that serial predators can operate in mid-sized American cities just as they do in major metropolitan areas, hidden in plain sight until science and determined investigation finally exposed them. Number 8. Brandon Dassinger, the Emmitsburg baby death and cover-up. In the early morning hours of July 18, 2008, emergency responders in Emmitsburg, Iowa, a small town in Palo Alto County, were called to a residence where they found a 4-month-old baby boy unresponsive and not breathing, beginning an investigation that would reveal a disturbing case of child abuse, murder, and attempted cover-up that shocked the community. Brandon Dassinger, age 21, the boyfriend of the baby's mother, claimed that he had found the infant not breathing after the child had been sleeping, suggesting that the death might be due to sudden infant death syndrome or some other natural cause. But medical personnel who examined the baby immediately suspected that the injuries were not consistent with a natural death. The baby, Kingston Hatton, was pronounced dead at the hospital, and an autopsy revealed that he had suffered severe blunt force trauma to his head, multiple rib fractures, and other injuries that could only have been caused by violent abuse, making it clear that this was a homicide rather than a tragic accident or natural death. Investigators from the Emmitsburg Police Department and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation began interviewing Dassinger and the baby's mother, Cassie Hatton, trying to determine who was responsible for the fatal injuries and whether there had been previous abuse that had gone unreported. Dassinger initially stuck to his story that he had simply found the baby unresponsive, but as investigators confronted him with the medical evidence showing that Kingston had been violently abused, his story began to change, eventually admitting that he had been alone with the baby when the fatal injuries occurred. Dassinger claimed that Kingston had been crying inconsolably and that he had lost control, shaking the baby violently and striking him in an attempt to make him stop crying. Actions that he claimed were momentary lapses rather than intentional murder, though the severity and pattern of injuries suggested sustained abuse rather than a single incident. The investigation revealed that there had been previous incidents where Kingston had shown signs of injury while in Dassinger's care, including bruising and what appeared to be healing fractures, suggesting a pattern of abuse that had been ongoing for weeks or months before the fatal assault. Cassie Hatton, the baby's mother, faced intense scrutiny from investigators about whether she had known about the abuse and failed to protect her son, and evidence suggested that she had noticed injuries but had accepted Dassinger's explanations rather than seeking medical attention or reporting suspected abuse. The case sparked outrage in the Emmitsburg community and across Iowa, with many questioning how a 4-month-old baby could be subjected to such sustained abuse without intervention from family members, neighbors, or others who might have noticed signs of distress or injury. Dassinger was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and child endangerment resulting in death, facing mandatory life imprisonment without parole if convicted, and the prosecution made clear that they viewed this as an intentional murder rather than an accident or momentary loss of control. The trial featured extensive medical testimony about Kingston's injuries, with forensic pathologists explaining that the pattern of fractures, brain trauma, and other injuries demonstrated repeated abuse over time, not a single incident of shaking or striking as Dassinger claimed. Expert witnesses testified about shaken baby syndrome and abusive head trauma, explaining how violent shaking can cause catastrophic brain injury and death in infants whose developing brains and weak neck muscles make them especially vulnerable to this type of abuse. The prosecution argued that Dassinger had targeted Kingston with escalating violence, abusing him repeatedly whenever the baby cried or needed attention, demonstrating a pattern of behavior that culminated in the fatal assault that killed the 4-month-old infant. Dassinger's defense attorneys argued that he did not intend to kill Kingston, and that the death resulted from a momentary loss of control rather than premeditated murder, suggesting that second-degree murder or manslaughter would be more appropriate charges. But the jury rejected this argument. On March 4, 2010, after several days of testimony and just a few hours of deliberation, the jury found Brandon Dassinger guilty of first-degree murder, concluding that he had killed Kingston Hatton with malice aforethought, even if the specific moment of death was not planned days in advance. Judge Stephen Carroll sentenced Dassinger to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Iowa, ensuring that Dassinger would never be released and would spend the rest of his life incarcerated for killing a helpless infant. Cassie Hatton was charged with child endangerment for failing to protect Kingston from Dassinger's abuse and for not seeking medical attention when her son showed signs of injury, and she pleaded guilty as part of a plea agreement, receiving a sentence of probation with strict conditions. The case highlighted the critical issue of child abuse in domestic settings, particularly the vulnerability of infants to abuse by non-parental caregivers such as mothers' boyfriends, a demographic that statistics show is at elevated risk for fatal child abuse compared to biological parents. Child welfare advocates used the Dassinger case to argue for better training for mandatory reporters, including daycare providers, teachers, and medical personnel, in recognizing signs of child abuse and understanding their legal obligations to report suspected abuse. The case also raised questions about the criminal justice system's response to caregivers who fail to protect children in their care from abuse by others, with some arguing that Cassie Hatton's sentence was too lenient given that her inaction allowed the abuse to continue until it became fatal. For the Hatton family, who lost their grandson and nephew to brutal violence, the case brought unbearable grief compounded by the knowledge that Kingston's mother had failed to protect him from his abuser, creating family divisions and trauma that would last for generations. Emmitsburg, a close-knit community of about 3,700 people, struggled to process how such violence could occur within their town, leading to community discussions about domestic violence, child protection, and how neighbors and community members can better support vulnerable families. The case led to changes in Iowa's child protection policies, including enhanced requirements for home visits by child welfare workers and improved coordination between law enforcement, medical providers, and child protective services when abuse is suspected. Brandon Dassinger remains incarcerated in the Iowa State Penitentiary, where he will spend the rest of his life, while Kingston Hatton's death stands as a tragic reminder that the most dangerous place for some children is their own home, and that society has a collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us. The Dassinger case is one of Iowa's most disturbing crimes because it involves the ultimate betrayal of trust and care. An adult's decision to respond to an infant's crying with violence that escalated to murder, destroying a young life that had barely begun and leaving a community to grapple with how such evil could exist in their midst. Number 9. Tyler Noe and the Winterset Farmhouse Murders. On September 30, 2013, Madison County Sheriff's deputies conducting a welfare check at a farmhouse outside Winterset, Iowa, discovered one of the most brutal crime scenes in the county's history, finding the bodies of 23-year-old Tyler Sash and 51-year-old Michael Cracked, both shot to death in what appeared to be a targeted execution-style double homicide. The investigation quickly focused on Tyler Noe, age 18, who had been friends with Sash and had been staying at the farmhouse periodically, and who neighbors reported seeing leaving the property in Crack's pickup truck shortly after the estimated time of the murders. Investigators learned that Noe had been struggling with methamphetamine addiction and had been in conflict with both victims over money and drug debts, providing a potential motive for the murders, though the level of violence used suggested something more personal than a simple dispute over drugs. Evidence recovered from the scene indicated that both victims had been shot multiple times at close range, with Sash suffering 7 gunshot wounds and Cracked suffering 9, demonstrating a level of overkill that suggested rage or a desire to ensure the victims were dead, rather than simple execution. Noe was arrested in Nebraska several days after the murders, driving Crack's stolen truck and in possession of firearms, ammunition, and other property taken from the crime scene, providing physical evidence linking him directly to the murders and theft. During interrogation, No gave conflicting accounts of what had happened, initially denying involvement, then claiming he had been present but someone else had done the shooting, and finally admitting that he had shot both men but claiming it was in self-defense during a confrontation over drugs and money. The investigation revealed that No had a history of petty crimes and drug use but no previous violent offenses, making the savage double murder seem like a dramatic escalation in criminal behavior, though interviews with associates suggested No had become increasingly unstable and paranoid due to his methamphetamine use. Forensic analysis of the crime scene contradicted No's self-defense claim, showing that both victims had been shot while in vulnerable positions, with Sash shot multiple times while lying on a couch and Cracked shot while apparently trying to flee or hide, suggesting this was an ambush rather than a confrontation where No faced imminent danger. Ballistics evidence confirmed that the firearms found in No's possession when he was arrested were the weapons used to kill Sash and Cracked, and gunshot residue testing showed that No had recently fired weapons, providing scientific corroboration of his confession. Tyler No was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, first-degree theft, and second-degree theft, facing mandatory life sentences without parole if convicted on the murder charges, and prosecutors announced they would seek consecutive sentences to ensure maximum punishment. The defense argued that No's severe methamphetamine addiction and mental health issues had impaired his judgment and ability to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder, suggesting that lesser charges of second-degree murder or manslaughter would be more appropriate. But prosecutors rejected any plea agreements, insisting on proceeding to trial on the most serious charges. The trial, held in 2014, featured graphic crime scene photographs and testimony from forensic pathologists about the nature of the victim's injuries, painting a picture of a brutal execution that was difficult for jury members and courtroom observers to witness without emotional impact. Family members of Tyler Sash and Michael Crack testified about the devastating impact of the murders, describing Sash as a young man with his whole life ahead of him and Cracked as a kind person who had offered No a place to stay and help when he needed it, making the betrayal and violence even more difficult to comprehend. The prosecution emphasized that No had not only killed 2 people but had done so in their own home, a place where they should have been safe, and had then callously stolen their property and fled, showing consciousness of guilt and complete lack of remorse for his actions. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding Tyler No guilty on all counts, including both first-degree murder charges, concluding that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated premeditated killing rather than self-defense or a crime of passion. On November 14, 2014, Madison County District Court Judge Robert Hutchison sentenced No to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders, plus additional time for the theft charges, ensuring that No would never be released from prison. The case devastated the Winterset community, a small town best known as the birthplace of John Wayne and for its covered bridges, forcing residents to confront a level of violence that seemed completely out of place in their peaceful rural setting. The murders highlighted the destructive impact of methamphetamine on Iowa communities, showing how drug addiction can escalate from petty crimes to the most serious violent offenses, destroying not just the user's life but the lives of everyone around them. Mental health and addiction treatment advocates pointed to the No case as an example of how the criminal justice system and society more broadly have failed to provide adequate intervention and treatment for young people struggling with substance abuse before they commit irreversible violent acts. The families of Tyler Sash and Michael Crack created memorials and scholarships in their loved ones' names, working to ensure they would be remembered for their lives rather than just for how they died, and advocating for better drug treatment resources in Madison County. The farmhouse where the murders occurred was eventually sold and the new owners completely renovated it, trying to erase the physical reminders of the violence that had occurred there, though the psychological scars on the community remained. Tyler No remains incarcerated in the Iowa prison system, where he will spend the rest of his life, his case serving as a stark warning about how quickly drug addiction and poor choices can lead to catastrophic violence that destroys multiple lives and families. The Madison County Sheriff's Office, a small rural law enforcement agency, was praised for their thorough investigation and successful prosecution of the case, demonstrating that even smaller departments can effectively investigate and solve the most serious crimes when they work diligently and follow proper procedures. For Iowa, the Winterset farmhouse murders represent another disturbing chapter in the state's ongoing struggle with methamphetamine, a drug that has brought unprecedented levels of violence to rural communities that were historically characterized by low crime rates and strong social cohesion. The case also raises broader questions about how communities can identify and intervene with troubled young people before they commit violent acts, and whether more robust mental health and addiction treatment infrastructure might prevent some of these tragedies. Today, Tyler Sash and Michael Cracked are remembered by their families and community as victims of senseless violence, their lives cut short by someone they had tried to help. Their murders a reminder that kindness and generosity can sometimes be met with betrayal and violence in a world where addiction and desperation can override humanity and conscience. Number 10. The West Liberty Murders, Rafael Morales and Homicidal Jealousy. On March 10, 2013, the small eastern Iowa town of West Liberty was rocked by a quadruple homicide when 4 people were found shot to death in 2 separate locations, launching a massive manhunt that would end with the arrest of Rafael Morales, age 41, a truck driver with a history of domestic violence who had snapped after learning that his estranged wife was seeing another man. The victims were identified as Morales' wife, Myra Morales, age 41, her mother Selena Morales Arcos, age 60, Myra's new boyfriend, Gregorio Juarez Ontiveros, age 40, and Morales Arcos' nephew, Hector Arcos, age 20. All shot multiple times in what investigators quickly determined was a targeted attack driven by jealousy and rage. The investigation revealed that Rafael and Myra Morales had been separated for several months and that Myra had filed for divorce and begun a new relationship with Juarez Ontiveros, developments that had enraged Rafael Morales and led to escalating threats and harassment against his estranged wife and her new boyfriend. On the night of the murders, Morales armed himself with a handgun and went to the mobile home where Myra was staying with her mother, confronting her about the new relationship and shooting both Myra and her mother multiple times when the argument escalated, executing them in cold blood while they begged for their lives. Morales then drove to a second location where Juarez Ontiveros lived with Hector Arcos, breaking into the residence and shooting both men multiple times, killing his romantic rival and an innocent bystander who had the misfortune of being present when Morales arrived seeking vengeance. After committing the 4 murders, Morales fled the scene, triggering a multi-state manhunt involving the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, the FBI, and law enforcement agencies across the Midwest who feared that Morales might continue his killing spree or attempt to flee to Mexico. Morales was apprehended approximately 12 hours after the murders at a truck stop in Missouri, found sleeping in his semi-truck and arrested without incident, though he was armed with the murder weapon and additional ammunition, suggesting he may have been preparing for further violence or a confrontation with police. During interrogation, Morales confessed to all 4 murders, providing detailed accounts of how he had killed each victim and explaining that he had been unable to accept that his wife had moved on with another man, viewing her new relationship as the ultimate betrayal that justified his violent response. The case attracted national media attention due to the number of victims and the domestic violence angle, with advocates using it to highlight how intimate partner violence can escalate to homicide, particularly when separation and new relationships are involved, risk factors that domestic violence experts have long identified as among the most dangerous periods for victims. The investigation revealed that Myra Morales had reported Rafael's threatening behavior to law enforcement multiple times in the months before the murders, and that she had obtained a protective order against him, but that these measures had ultimately failed to protect her or prevent the violence. Law enforcement officials acknowledged that while protective orders can be effective tools in many domestic violence situations, they are ultimately just pieces of paper that cannot physically prevent a determined abuser from attacking their victim, raising difficult questions about how to better protect domestic violence victims who are at extreme risk. Rafael Morales was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and faced mandatory life sentences without parole on each count. And unlike some defendants who try to minimize their culpability, Morales showed little remorse and seemed to believe his actions were justified by his wife's perceived betrayal. The trial, held in 2014, was relatively brief as Morales had confessed, and there was overwhelming physical evidence linking him to all 4 murders, making conviction virtually certain and leaving the jury with the straightforward task of confirming what everyone already knew. Family members of the victims testified about the devastating impact of losing 4 people in a single act of violence, describing how the murders had destroyed their family structure and left children orphaned and a community traumatized. Myra Morales was remembered as a strong woman who had found the courage to leave an abusive relationship and try to build a new life, only to have that new life violently stolen from her by the man she had tried to escape. Selena Morales Arcos was described as a devoted mother and grandmother who had opened her home to her daughter during a difficult time, losing her life simply because she was present when her son-in-law came seeking revenge. Gregorio Juarez Ontiveros was mourned as a hard-working man whose only crime was falling in love with Myra and trying to build a future with her, becoming a target simply because he represented what Rafael Morales had lost. Hector Arcos, the youngest victim at just 20 years old, was remembered as an innocent bystander with no involvement in the relationship drama, killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time when Morales came to murder Juarez Ontiveros. The jury found Rafael Morales guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die in prison and never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. The West Liberty community, a town of approximately 3,700 people with a significant Latino population, was devastated by the quadruple homicide, with many residents knowing the victims personally and struggling to comprehend how such violence could erupt in their peaceful community. The case highlighted the particular vulnerability of immigrant communities to domestic violence, as victims may be reluctant to report abuse due to language barriers, cultural factors, immigration status concerns, or lack of familiarity with available resources and legal protections. Domestic violence organizations used the West Liberty murders to advocate for better resources for Latino victims of domestic violence, including Spanish-language hotlines, culturally competent counseling services, and community education about the warning signs of escalating abuse. The case also demonstrated the inadequacy of protective orders alone to prevent domestic violence homicides, leading to calls for more comprehensive safety planning, including emergency relocation assistance, enhanced monitoring of high-risk abusers, and better coordination between civil and criminal justice systems. For the children left orphaned by the murders, including Myra and Rafael's own children who lost both parents, the trauma was particularly profound, as they struggled not only with grief but with the knowledge that their father had murdered their mother, creating psychological wounds that would require years of therapy and support to heal. Rafael Morales remains incarcerated in the Iowa State Penitentiary, where he will spend the rest of his life, his case serving as a tragic example of how jealousy, possessiveness, and the inability to accept the end of a relationship can lead to the most extreme violence. The West Liberty murders stand as one of the most disturbing crimes in Iowa history, not because of the method or the setting, but because of what they represent. The deadly culmination of domestic violence, the failure of systems designed to protect victims, and the devastating ripple effects that mass murder has on families, communities, and particularly on the innocent children left behind to make sense of unspeakable loss. The case continues to resonate in Iowa's domestic violence prevention community, frequently cited as an example of why threats from intimate partners must be taken seriously and why separation and new relationships are particularly high-risk periods that require enhanced safety planning and support. Today, memorials to the 4 victims serve as reminders of lives cut short by violence and as calls to action for anyone who witnesses warning signs of domestic violence to speak up, intervene, and support victims before threats escalate to tragedy. Honoring the dead by working to prevent future murders and protect those still at risk. The West Liberty community, a town of approximately 3,700 people with a significant Latino population, was devastated by the quadruple homicide, with many residents knowing the victims personally and struggling to comprehend how such violence could erupt in their peaceful community. The case highlighted the particular vulnerability of immigrant communities to domestic violence, as victims may be reluctant to report abuse due to language barriers, cultural factors, immigration status concerns, or lack of familiarity with available resources and legal protections. Domestic violence organizations used the West Liberty murders to advocate for better resources for Latino victims of domestic violence, including Spanish-language hotlines, culturally competent counseling services, and community education about the warning signs of escalating abuse. The case also demonstrated the inadequacy of protective orders alone to prevent domestic violence homicides, leading to calls for more comprehensive safety planning, including emergency relocation assistance, enhanced monitoring of high-risk abusers, and better coordination between civil and criminal justice systems. For the children left orphaned by the murders, including Myra and Rafael's own children who lost both parents, the trauma was particularly profound, as they struggled not only with grief but with the knowledge that their father had murdered their mother, creating psychological wounds that would require years of therapy and support to heal. Rafael Morales remains incarcerated in the Iowa State Penitentiary, where he will spend the rest of his life, his case serving as a tragic example of how jealousy, possessiveness, and the inability to accept the end of a relationship can lead to the most extreme violence. The West Liberty murders stand as one of the most disturbing crimes in Iowa history, not because of the method or the setting, but because of what they represent. The deadly culmination of domestic violence, the failure of systems designed to protect victims, and the devastating ripple effects that mass murder has on families, communities, and particularly on the innocent children left behind to make sense of unspeakable loss. The case continues to resonate in Iowa's domestic violence prevention community, frequently cited as an example of why threats from intimate partners must be taken seriously and why separation and new relationships are particularly high-risk periods that require enhanced safety planning and support. Today, memorials to the 4 victims serve as reminders of lives cut short by violence and as calls to action for anyone who witnesses warning signs of domestic violence to speak up, intervene, and support victims before threats escalate to tragedy. Honoring the dead by working to prevent future murders and protect those still at risk.